The teenager alien royal offended the human, so he turned and walked away without a word. James Carter had been stationed on the Zalarian capital for nearly 6 months now. As a soldier for the Galactic Peacekeeping Force, his job was to maintain peace among the various alien species, humans included. But it wasn't always easy. Zalarian culture was as ancient as it was complicated, and human relations with their people were still in the early stages of diplomacy. But James was used to difficult tasks. He'd faced challenges before and had never backed down. Today, however, felt different. He was about to meet the Zalarian royal family, an honor, some would say, though James had never been one to put much stock in titles. He was a soldier, not a diplomat. The palace was vast, filled with columns that reached high into the ceiling, each one adorned with intricate carvings of alien history. The air smelled faintly of exotic flowers, and the sounds of distant conversations echoed across the halls. James walked with purpose, his uniform sharp, his mind focused on the task ahead. At the royal court, the Zalarian elite had gathered for an event, a diplomatic summit, or so it was called. The leaders of various species, including humans, had come to discuss trade and peace treaties. As James entered the grand hall, he was struck by the sheer size of the gathering. The room was filled with dignitaries, alien species from far and wide, all mingling and exchanging pleasantries. But his attention was quickly drawn to one figure, a young woman sitting on a raised throne at the front of the room, Princess Ilara. She was the youngest of the royal family, barely a teenager in Zalarian years, but already a force to be reckoned with. Ilara had inherited the full power of her lineage, a mind sharp as a blade, and an aura of authority that seemed to command respect even from those who did not know her. Her long, silver hair cascaded down her back in waves, and her eyes gleamed with an intensity that made even the bravest of soldiers think twice before crossing her path. James had heard rumors about her, a brilliant tactician, a skilled fighter, and most notably, fiercely independent. She didn't seem to care much for the formality and grandeur of her title. In fact, she often made it clear she thought less of the whole idea of royal rule. As James approached the throne, he caught her gaze. She looked him up and down, her expression unreadable. There was a flash of something in her eyes, curiosity, perhaps, but it quickly faded, replaced by an arrogant smirk. "Ah, the human soldier," she said, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "How quaint! I would have expected more from your kind, but I suppose you're here to listen to our superior wisdom." The room fell silent at her words. James could feel the eyes of the room on him, waiting for a response. It wasn't uncommon for aliens to look down on humans. After all, they had advanced technologies, millennia of history, and powers that humanity could only dream of. But James wasn't here to argue. He was a soldier and he had a mission. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stood there, his expression calm, his hands clasped behind his back. His silence wasn't an act of submission, it was an act of control. In the face of insult, he would not be provoked. He would not be drawn into a petty battle of words. Princess Ilara's eyes narrowed. "You have nothing to say?" she scoffed. "I expected more from someone representing the mighty humans. Maybe I was wrong to think you might be worth my time." The princess stood up from her throne, the movement sharp and deliberate. She was taller than most of the beings in the room, her posture straight, her presence commanding. Her gaze never wavered from James, as if daring him to respond, to do something, anything that might challenge her words. But James didn't rise to the challenge. He didn't even blink. His face remained neutral, his gaze unwavering. After a few tense seconds, Ilara's smirk faded. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes flashed with frustration. She was not used to being ignored, let alone being outdone in a battle of wits. For a moment it seemed as if she might say more, but then she turned sharply, walking away from her throne and heading towards the exit. The room buzzed with murmurs as the princess left, but James didn't react. He stood perfectly still, his eyes now scanning the room as though nothing had happened. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the next step of his mission. The princess's words had not fazed him, nor would they. He had learned long ago that power did not come from words. Power came from actions, and as for her, she was young and her arrogance would be her downfall sooner or later. But James knew that the game had only just begun. The princess might have been trying to provoke him, but it was he who would have the last word. He would see to it that his silence spoke louder than her insults. Later that evening, after the royal summit had concluded, James found himself walking the quiet corridors of the palace, reflecting on the events of the day. The princess was a force to be reckoned with, no doubt. But James had been trained to remain calm, to stay focused on the mission, no matter the distractions. As he passed through an archway, he spotted Alara once more. She stood by herself, her back to him, looking out over the city that lay beneath the palace. She appeared lost in thought, her posture no longer proud but somewhat deflated, as though the weight of her own arrogance had finally begun to sink in. James hesitated for a moment. He could have approached her, offered some words of advice, or perhaps even confronted her about her behavior. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away as he had done earlier. He had no need for confrontation, no desire to get caught up in her games. He was a soldier, not a pawn in her royal chessboard. And so, as the sounds of the bustling palace faded behind him, James Carter walked away, leaving the princess to ponder the strange silence that had been his reply. The next few days passed in a blur. The royal summit continued with discussions, treaties, and diplomatic talks. James attended every meeting, keeping a low profile as usual, but he couldn't shake the memory of the princess. Alara's words, her arrogance, the way she had looked at him, these things lingered in his mind, but he pushed them aside. He was here for one purpose, peace, but the princess seemed determined to keep him in her sights. No matter where he went in the palace, there she was, always watching, always observing. He could feel her eyes on him from across the room, her gaze sharp and challenging. She didn't make it easy for him. It was clear she wanted something, perhaps a reaction, or maybe to prove to herself that humans were beneath her. At one of the evening gatherings, James stood in a quiet corner, watching as the various alien dignitaries mingled. He had never been one for socializing, especially with those who looked at him like a curiosity. As he sipped his drink, he caught sight of Alara again. This time she was speaking with a group of her closest advisors, but her eyes kept flicking to him, as though she was waiting for him to make the first move. It wasn't long before she approached. "So the human soldier stands in the corner, quietly observing?" she asked, her voice laced with mockery. "Do you find the grand Zalarian court so dull, or are you simply afraid of speaking in front of your betters?" James turned to face her, his expression unchanged. "I'm not here to entertain you, princess," he said simply. "I'm here for the peace talks. You should focus on that." Alara's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Peace talks. You humans talk a lot about peace, don't you?" She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "But you know, I've been thinking, maybe you don't understand what real power is. Maybe I can show you." Before James could respond, Alara turned on her heel and walked away, but not without one last glance over her shoulder. It was clear that she was trying to provoke him again, to challenge his composure. But James didn't rise to the bait. He knew that she was testing him, seeing how much she could push before he snapped. The next day, the princess appeared at the training grounds, where the various soldiers from different races practiced their combat skills. James was there, as usual, perfecting his techniques in hand-to-hand combat. He didn't expect the princess to be there. She was royalty, after all, and these kinds of things were beneath her, or so he thought. But there she was, standing at the edge of the training area, watching him with that same intense gaze. Her arms were crossed, her posture as regal as ever. James couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked among the warriors. Her elegance contrasted sharply with the rough-and-tumble nature of the training field. He finished his routine and approached her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though he knew she wouldn't listen. "This isn't the place for someone of your status." Alara smirked. "I've been watching you, human. You're skilled, but your strength lies in silence. You never speak. You never challenge anyone. It's as if you're afraid to show who you really are." James felt a flicker of annoyance, but he suppressed it. "I don't need to show anyone anything." "Oh, but you do," she replied, her voice now a bit softer, almost teasing. "You see, I don't believe in pretending. I believe in showing your strength. And you humans seem like someone who hides behind his silence. I wonder if you're afraid of being defeated, afraid of showing how weak you really are." Her words stung, but James didn't let it show. He took a step back, maintaining his calm. "I'm not afraid of anything. But I don't feel the need to prove myself to anyone, least of all you." Alara's eyes flashed with something James couldn't quite place. Was it anger or something else? "Very well," she said. "Then let's see if you can prove it." Without another word, she gestured for one of her guards to step forward. The guard, a large, muscular Zalarian, approached with a confident swagger. "You'll fight him, human. Prove to us all that you're not just a silent coward." James looked at the guard. He was much larger than James, his muscles bulging beneath his armor. It would be a difficult fight, but James wasn't the type to back down, not when his honor was on the line. "I don't need to fight your guard to prove anything," James said, but his voice was firm. "I'll fight, but not for your amusement." Ilara smiled, clearly enjoying the challenge. "Fine, let's see how long you last then." The guard stepped forward, and the two men squared off in the center of the training ground. The crowd of onlookers, many of them Zalarian soldiers, gathered around to watch the human face off against one of their own. They knew James was good, but no one expected him to stand a chance against the giant before him. The fight began. The guard lunged first, aiming a powerful blow at James's chest. But James was quick. He sidestepped, using the guard's own momentum against him. He delivered a sharp punch to the guard's ribs, causing the Zalarian to grunt in pain. The crowd murmured in surprise, but James didn't allow himself to get distracted. His focus was sharp, every movement calculated. The fight continued, with James dodging and countering, his movements swift and precise. The guard's strength was overwhelming, but James had the advantage of speed and agility. Minutes passed, and the fight was growing more intense. James had taken a few blows, but he didn't falter. He was tired, but he kept pushing. The guard, meanwhile, was starting to slow, his breathing heavy. James could see it. The guard wasn't used to being outmaneuvered. He was used to dominating, not fighting someone who could match his skill. Finally, James saw his opportunity. The guard made a sloppy move, leaving himself open for a counterattack. James quickly closed the distance, using a combination of punches and a swift knee to the guard's abdomen to bring him to the ground. The guard fell hard, unable to continue the fight. The crowd was silent. Ilara stood at the edge of the training field, her expression unreadable. James stood over the fallen guard, his chest heaving with exertion. He hadn't spoken a word throughout the fight, his silence now even more powerful than before. Ilara stepped forward, her eyes never leaving James. "Well done, human," she said, her voice low but sincere. "You've proved something today, not to me but to yourself. Perhaps I misjudged you." James didn't reply. He simply nodded and turned, walking away from the training ground. He had made his point, and that was enough for him. Ilara's challenge had been answered, not with words but with action. As James left the field, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. He had walked away from the princess once again, but this time, he knew it wasn't just because he was ignoring her. He had earned her respect, and in a way, that was more than enough. The days following the challenge were different. There was an unease in the air, a subtle shift in how people looked at James. These Zalarian soldiers, once dismissive of him, now watched him with a mix of respect and curiosity. He had proven himself in combat, and though it wasn't a fight for glory or pride, it was a fight that spoke volumes. He had faced one of their strongest warriors and won, not by brute strength, but by skill, discipline, and the one thing they underestimated: silence. But it was the princess, Ilara, who had changed the most. After the duel, she had watched him in a way that James couldn't quite understand. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like admiration, perhaps, but also a challenge. She no longer saw him just as a human soldier. She saw him as a puzzle, one she needed to solve. For the next few days, she kept her distance but watched him from afar. At every event, every gathering, James could feel her eyes on him. He had become a subject of fascination for her. She tried to act indifferent, but James could see through her facade. She was no longer mocking him, but something in her had shifted. She no longer seemed to think of him as a lesser being. One evening, when the moonlight shone brightly through the grand palace windows, James was walking alone in the palace gardens. The stars were clear above, the air cool and peaceful. He enjoyed moments like these where he could be alone with his thoughts, away from the politics, away from the pressures of the mission. The quiet suited him, but tonight was different. As he walked along the path lined with flowers, he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Ilara, she didn't speak at first. There was an awkward silence between them as she caught up with him. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft yet firm. "You won," she said, her tone more respectful than he had heard from her before. "In the duel, you won because you didn't fight like a beast. You fought like a strategist." James stopped walking and turned to face her. She stood a few steps behind him, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. He could see the curiosity in her eyes, but also a hint of something deeper, perhaps an unfamiliar respect. "I didn't need to prove anything to you, Princess," James said simply. "I only fought because you pushed me to." Ilara's gaze hardened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it. "You think I don't know that? I didn't push you to fight, James. I pushed you to see if you were capable of standing up, not for me, for yourself." There was silence between them once more. James was unsure how to respond. He wasn't interested in explaining himself to her, but something in her words made him pause. She had expected him to fight. She had expected him to act the way humans always acted when provoked, loud, brash, and filled with emotion. But he had done none of that. He had kept his calm, and now she was forced to rethink everything she had ever believed about humans. "I'm not the kind of soldier you're used to," James said after a long pause. "I don't fight for glory, I fight to protect." Ilara seemed to consider this, her brow furrowing slightly. "You protect what?" "Peace," James replied. "You may think we're weak because we don't have the power or technology of other species, but that's not where true strength lies. Strength is in our choices. And we choose peace even when it's hard." Ilara stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You think you know what strength is?" she asked, her voice challenging once more. "I know it's not about fighting for the sake of fighting," James answered calmly. "It's about knowing when to fight and when to walk away." The words hung in the air between them for a moment before Ilara spoke again, her voice softer this time. "You walked away from me before, when I insulted you, when I mocked your species. I thought you were weak, but now I see I was wrong." James didn't respond right away. There was a part of him that wanted to tell her that it wasn't about being right or wrong, but about understanding each other. But he knew she wasn't ready to hear that yet. So he remained silent, his eyes meeting hers. Ilara took a step back, looking down for a moment as if lost in thought. Then she looked back up at him with a serious expression. "I don't like being wrong," she said slowly. "I don't like feeling like I've been outsmarted. And you outsmarted me. You didn't play my game, and that's something I respect." James was surprised by her admission. He had expected more arrogance, more pride, but instead he saw a vulnerability he hadn't noticed before. For the first time, he could see beyond the princess's royal facade. She wasn't just the cold, untouchable ruler everyone thought she was. She was someone struggling to find her place in the universe, someone who didn't have all the answers. "I didn't outsmart you," James said quietly. "I just didn't play." Ilara's lips twitched as though she were about to smile, but she quickly controlled it. "Perhaps, but you still won, and now you've given me something to think about. Something I haven't had to think about before, a different way of seeing things." There was an awkward silence between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Ilara spoke again, her tone more serious. "You said you fight for peace," she began. "But what happens when peace is threatened? What happens when someone challenges everything you believe in? What do you do then?" James met her gaze. "Then you fight, but not for revenge, not for power. You fight to protect what you believe in. To protect those who can't protect themselves." Ilara seemed to process this for a moment. She looked at him as though she were seeing him in a new light. There was no mockery in her expression now, no arrogance, just a hint of understanding, of curiosity. "You know," she said softly, "I think you might be the first person to ever make me question everything I've been taught." James gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That's the point, Princess. Sometimes it takes someone from the outside to show you what you can't see from the inside." Ilara stood silently for a moment. Then she sighed and turned her back on him, walking a few steps before looking back over her shoulder. "I'll never stop being a Zalarian," she said, her voice more thoughtful than before. "But maybe, just maybe, I can learn a few things from you humans." James didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew that Ilara had taken the first step toward understanding. The rest would come in time. As she walked away, James couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. Maybe it was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where the princess would no longer see humans as weak, and where he could show her that silence, at times, could speak louder than words. The days following their conversation in the garden were quieter, yet there was an undeniable tension between James and Princess Ilara. She had stopped mocking him, but there was still something unspoken between them. Her gaze lingered on him more often, her sharp eyes always watching, always measuring. James didn't mind it. He had learned long ago to ignore the judgment of others, but there was something about her scrutiny that felt different now. It wasn't hostile, it was curious. Ilara began seeking him out in the palace more frequently. She would appear at the training grounds, watching him spar with other soldiers or practice his techniques. She never interrupted, never spoke unless necessary, but her presence was a constant reminder that things between them were changing. One evening, after a long day of meetings, James found himself walking along the corridors of the palace once more. He needed some time to clear his mind, to process the events of the day. The political talks had become more intense, and there were whispers of unrest among the other species. It was clear that peace was still fragile, and James couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. As he rounded a corner, he nearly collided with someone. He stopped just in time, his hand coming up to steady himself. When he looked up, he saw that it was Ilara. "You always walk so quietly," she remarked, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I almost didn't hear you coming." James nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've learned to move quietly. It's useful when you're trying to stay out of trouble." Ilara's eyes softened for a moment. "I wouldn't say you're in trouble," she replied, her voice gentler than usual. "But you have a way of disappearing into the background. It's almost like you're hiding." James raised an eyebrow. "I don't hide," he said. "I just don't draw attention to myself unless it's necessary." Ilara seemed to consider this, her brow furrowing slightly. "I don't understand you, James. You're so different from everyone else I've met. The way you carry yourself, the way you don't react the way others expect you to. It's as though you're always in control of yourself, always calm, always distant." James glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Maybe it's because I've learned that control is the only thing I can rely on. In a world like this, where everything is uncertain, it's the only thing that keeps me grounded." Ilara studied him for a long moment, her gaze intense. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she asked quietly. "You're not like other soldiers. You don't fight for the same reasons they do." "No," James agreed, his voice low. "I fight to protect the people who can't protect themselves, to keep the peace even when it's hard. It's not about glory or power, it's about what's right." There was silence between them as Ilara absorbed his words. She seemed to be searching for something in his expression, as if trying to unlock the mystery that was James Carter. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "You're not afraid of losing control, are you?" she asked. "You're afraid of what happens if you ever let go." James didn't answer right away. The truth was, she was right. He was afraid, not of physical loss, but of losing control over the one thing he could always count on, his own emotions. He had seen too much, done too much to ever allow himself to break. If he lost control, if he let his emotions dictate his actions, it would be the end of everything he had worked for. The peace he fought for would crumble. But he couldn't say that to her. Not yet. "No," he finally said, his voice steady. "I'm not afraid, but I've learned to keep a distance. It's better that way." Ilara looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. Then, without a word, she turned and began walking down the corridor. James watched her go, feeling the familiar pull in his chest. A feeling he couldn't name, a sensation that was both foreign and unsettling. For the rest of the evening, James couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. It lingered with him as he went through the motions of his duties, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Ilara's words. She had seen through him, seen the parts of him he had buried deep inside. And now he wondered if he could continue hiding them from her. The next day, James found himself at the palace's observation deck, looking out over the sprawling city below. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the skyline. He liked to come here when he needed to clear his head. The quiet solitude helped him think. As he stood there, lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Ilara, I thought I might find you here," she said softly, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. James didn't reply right away. He just watched as she came to stand beside him, her gaze also turned toward the city. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, almost peaceful, despite the tension that had built between them over the past few days. Finally, Ilara spoke again. "You're a soldier," she said, her voice quiet. "But you're not like the others. You don't fight for the same reasons they do. You fight for something greater than yourself." James didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He had fought alongside many soldiers in his life, but none of them had ever understood his reasons. They fought because it was their duty, their job, their calling. But for James, it was more than that. It was a personal mission, a responsibility that he couldn't escape. "I think I understand now," Ilara continued. "I've been so caught up in my own world, in my own position, that I never stopped to think about what others are fighting for. I've been so focused on my role as a princess that I forgot what it meant to be human." James turned to look at her, his expression softening. "You're not alone in that. Everyone gets caught up in their own world. It's easy to forget the bigger picture." Ilara looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You've taught me something, James. Something I never expected to learn, about strength, about control, and about what it means to protect others." James shook his head. "I haven't taught you anything, Princess. You've learned that yourself." Ilara smiled slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Maybe. But I wouldn't have learned it if I hadn't met you." For the first time, there was no challenge in her eyes, no arrogance. There was only understanding, a recognition of something more between them. James didn't know what to make of it, but he felt a small shift in the air. A connection that had formed quietly between them, unspoken but undeniable. "You don't have to call me Princess," Ilara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not anymore." James nodded but didn't respond. He didn't need to say anything. The understanding between them was enough. As the evening continued, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the world in a warm, golden light. James and Ilara stood together, in the silence of the moment, sharing a quiet bond that neither had expected. And for the first time, James allowed himself to believe that peace might be more than just an idea. It might actually be possible. The days grew more intense after the conversations in the garden and on the observation deck. Tensions between the different species in the galaxy were rising. There were whispers of rebellion, of factions within the Empire that wanted more power, and of political alliances shifting like sand beneath their feet. James had seen it all before, the delicate balance of peace, constantly threatened by greed, fear, and pride. But now it felt different. There was a weight on his shoulders, heavier than before. Ilara had become a constant presence in his life. The princess who had once mocked him, who had underestimated humanity, was now seeking his counsel. Not as a soldier, but as someone who had a different way of seeing things, someone who didn't get caught up in the politics or the posturing. It wasn't long before the situation that had been brewing for weeks finally came to a head. A coup had been planned by a faction within the Zalarian military, those who believed the current leadership was weak and that the Empire needed to assert its dominance over the galaxy. James had no illusions about what this meant. It meant war. It meant the kind of violence that could tear everything apart. As soon as he heard the news, he sought out Ilara. He knew she would be the key to preventing the worst of the chaos. The people who were plotting against the throne didn't just want power, they wanted to tear down everything that had been built. And with her leadership, Ilara could stop them. James found her in the royal council chamber, pacing back and forth, her mind clearly racing. Her eyes were sharp, but there was something else there, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. He could see that she was struggling with the weight of what was happening. "Princess," he said, stepping into the room, "we don't have much time." Ilara looked up at him, her expression hardening as she processed his words. "I know," she replied. "I've just been told about the coup. They're already gathering forces, and we don't have enough time to mobilize the royal army. If we wait too long, we'll be too late." James stepped forward, his face serious. "Then we act now. We need to stop this before it escalates. You're the only one who can prevent it." For a long moment, Ilara said nothing. She simply stared at him as though weighing his words carefully. Then with a deep breath, she finally spoke. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice low. "I don't know if I'm ready. My whole life I've been told that power means strength. But what if I fail? What if I'm not enough?" James walked closer to her, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't have to do this alone. You have allies. You have me." Ilara looked at him, her expression softening slightly. For the first time, she didn't look like a princess with all the answers. She looked like someone who was uncertain, someone who was still learning. And James could see it. That was the thing that made her different from the others. She wasn't blinded by her power or her title. She was willing to learn. "I've never known what it means to truly lead," Ilara said, her voice trembling just slightly. "I've always been told what to do, how to act, what's expected of me. But now I don't know what's right. What if I choose the wrong path?" James stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "Sometimes the right choice isn't clear, but you have to trust yourself, trust what you've learned. You've already made the right decision by not following in the footsteps of those who came before you. You're not like them, you don't have to be. Elara took a deep breath, her gaze steadying as she met his eyes. There was no fear in her expression now, just resolve. You're right, she said. I can't let fear control me, I won't let them win. James gave her a small nod, a hint of pride in his eyes. That's the spirit, now we have work to do. Together they began to make plans. James worked alongside Elara, offering his strategic advice, helping her to assemble a group of trusted soldiers who could help them move quickly and efficiently. But it wasn't just about the military. It was about convincing the people. The Zalarian Empire had been built on loyalty, but loyalty was a fragile thing. In times of crisis, it could easily shift. We need to show them that we're fighting for something greater, James said. This isn't just about power, it's about the future. Elara agreed. She spent hours addressing the people of the Empire, speaking from her heart. She told them the truth, that there was a threat to their way of life and that she needed their help to stop it. Her words were not those of a cold ruler, but of someone who understood the struggles of the people. She spoke of unity, of standing together against those who would tear the Empire apart for their own gain. As the hours passed, Elara's resolve grew stronger. James could see it in her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by something far more powerful, hope. She was no longer the princess who felt trapped by her title. She was a leader, one who understood that true strength came from within. When the time came to confront the leaders of the coup, Elara stood at the front of her army, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. James stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon, ready to fight if necessary. But they didn't need to fight. Elara's speech, her leadership, and the unity of the people had already done the hard work. The coup leaders were arrested without a single shot fired. The rebellion that could have torn the empire apart was over before it had even begun. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and peace was restored, James found himself standing beside Elara once again, looking out over the city. The war they had feared had never come, and the empire was safe. But more than that, Elara had proven something to herself. She had proven that she could lead, that she could make the tough decisions and stand strong in the face of uncertainty. You did it, James said, his voice low. Elara turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. We did it, she corrected him. Without you, I don't know if I could have. You helped me see what I couldn't. James smiled, though it was a small smile, the kind he rarely showed. You didn't need me, you just needed to believe in yourself. Elara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I think I finally understand what you meant, about strength. It's not about power or control or being perfect. It's about doing what's right even when it's hard. James looked out over the city with her, the weight of their journey settling into the silence between them. He didn't need to say anything more. They had both come a long way, and perhaps in the end they had both changed. The princess had learned the true meaning of leadership, and James had learned that sometimes silence was the loudest form of strength. And together they had forged a path forward, a path of peace,